breaks the bow and shatters the spear. Gentleness reigns when God is near. God is our refuge and strength, the one on whom we depend. Though the mountains may fall to the heart of the sea, I shall not fear, for God is with me. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. Lord Almighty, who is with us? The God of Jacob is our fortress. God is our refuge and strength, the one on whom we depend. Though the mountains may fall to the heart of the sea, I shall not fear, for God is with me. God is our refuge and strength, the one on whom we depend. Though the mountains may fall to the heart of the sea, I shall not fear, for God is with me. Shadows all around me, starless is my night. And now that love has found me, I've been living in the light. Well, day and night shine a bright, bright light. Bright be the light of God. A day and night shine a bright, bright light. Bright be the light of God. Waiting for the sunrise to come and fill the sky. I can see the sunshine when I look into your eyes. Day and night shine a bright, bright light. Bright be the light of God. A day and night shine a bright, bright light. Bright be the light of God. We are walking in 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 the light of God. Your day and night shine a bright, bright light. Bright in the light of God. A day and night shine a bright, bright light. Bright be the light of God. Oh, day and night shine a bright, bright light. Bright be the light of God. A day and night shine a bright, bright light. God, we are walking. Be the light. Walking in the light.
Many are the wonders of God. Many doors open wide. Many roads that are still untraveled.
Many are the gifts that we share, many burdens we bear, many mysteries still unraveled. Many gifts, one spirit of love, one spirit of life. Many gifts, one spirit of love, one spirit of love. Some will be the teachers of life, some the preachers of love, some the fathers and some the mothers. Some will be the ones who will care, some will listen and share, serving God as they serve each other. Many gifts, one spirit of love, one spirit of love. Many gifts, one spirit of love, one spirit of love.
Living as the body of Christ, and the heart of the earth, and the hands that will break new ground.
Celebrate the gifts from within. Now it's time to begin. God's people turn this world around now. Many gifts, one spirit of love, one spirit of love. Many gifts, one spirit of love, one spirit of love. Oh, many gifts, one spirit of love, one spirit of love. Yeah, yeah. Morning breaking, night is fading out. Day and evening find their common ground. You see it your way and I see it mine. This is where we see things eye to eye. In the moment where the light meets night, we'll be standing side by side. It doesn't matter if you're left or right, if we're both on the side of love, on the side of love, on the side of love. In the places you and I collide, fear divides us, locks us up inside. Knock down, drag out, soul search, fight. My heart wants to be so open wide. In the moment where the light meets night, we'll be standing side by side. we'll be standing side by side. It doesn't matter if you're left or right, if we're both on the side of love. In the magic of the chance we share, we can take this feeling anywhere. Make it happen if we only dare to stand on the side of love, on the side of love, on the side of love.
Hello, Kentucky Disciples, and thanks for including us in your virtual regional assembly. I'm Caroline Hamilton-Arnold. I have the privilege of serving as Associate Director for Domestic Disaster Response with Week of Compassion.
And I'm Josh Baird, the Director for Disciples Volunteering, Ministry of Disciples Home Missions.
Week of Compassion and Disciples Volunteering are the two main disaster response ministries for the General Church of the Disciples of Christ. And part of our work in disaster relief, response, and recovery is actually preparing congregations for disasters, that we are better able to respond to the needs of our churches and our communities if we have thought about disasters a little bit in advance and hopefully taken some steps to mitigate our own risk, to understand the dynamics and typical patterns of disaster recovery, and to think about what assets do we bring to a community and how we could be involved to provide relief and support recovery for our neighbors after a disaster. So we will give some overview of the phases of disaster. We'll give some examples of how disciples are engaged or have been engaged during past disasters. And we'll provide some resources and tools so you can take some concrete steps to become more prepared.
We're going to walk through together a description of the phases of disaster, which you can see in this laid out in this circle.
The beginning of these phases is warning and the event itself, which is appropriate because we are talking about preparedness today, to think about what kinds of events have warning and which events do not. What unexpected, expected events are likely in your areas, and how can you prepare with the kind of warning you have now? And how can you prepare when there are specific warnings for a tornado or some other severe weather event? And what preparation do you need to make for things where you may not get a warning? An earthquake, for example. The first phase as the event is unfolding is the actual impact of the disaster and that emergency rescue phase. This is when you have capital F, capital R first responders doing life-saving measures. We're helping people evacuate from high water areas. It's emergency medical assistance. It's firefighters and other first responders making sure people and property are safe.
And this is followed by the relief phase of disaster. This is when people spring into action, when the immediate emergency has passed, when it may be safe to be outside of shelter again, and where all of the concerns and focus and energy is basically on triage, meeting the most pressing needs for emergency shelter, for food, for basic security, and comfort medical needs as well.
For disciples, this is a time when we are really reliant on local congregations. Week of Compassion engages during this time by helping to connect you, local disciples, local congregations, and regions with the responses that are going on in your areas. We're also relying on you to tell us what's going on. You have eyes on what is really happening on the ground, and are providing relief to your neighbors. So we have grant funds that help when disciple buildings or members' homes are damaged. And we also have grants that help to support the work of local congregations. So you'll see here these buckets. Some of you may have compiled buckets like these for Church World Service or other organizations that have various cleanup supplies in them. After Hurricane Florence, our disciples in North Carolina were really active in coordinating the distribution of these buckets to their communities and folks in need. And that's a pretty common way that disciples are engaged afterwards, with things like distribution of supplies, feeding neighbors, helping to do some cleanup for members and other folks around in our communities.
After the relief winds down, there is a really awkward period in recovery that we call the assessment phase of disaster. This is when immediate needs for the most part have been taken care of, that triage is complete. Folks may very well be in a temporary status in terms of shelter, for example, but for a variety of reasons, recovery itself is not yet ready to begin. So that a lot of what happens in the assessment phase is happening behind closed doors, in non-COVID times, over Zoom meetings. These days, it's a lot of planning, a lot of assessing for what the long-term needs are likely to be, as well as what resources are currently or likely to be available. It's strategizing with partners, as in this picture where we gathered with partners in Pamlico County, North Carolina, to talk about where the most pressing needs were, where overlooked communities were as well, and strategize around the best way to move forward toward a recovery plan together. It's a frustrating time, especially for those who have been through the disaster, because it feels like very little is happening, but in fact a great deal of energy is going into this sort of organizational activity, the planning, and at the same time individuals are likely working through their own processes, whether they're walking through getting help from FEMA or the Small Business Administration, whether they're working with their own insurance company to make sure that they're taken care of appropriately, and that they have the resources they need then to be able to mount their long-term recovery.
Disciples are engaged in this phase in different ways, but Josh and I both work with local communities to try and connect our disciple leaders and congregations with the community organizations that are doing a lot of that planning. And so as we're thinking about disaster preparedness, one of the things that helps is knowing that these phases happen and having some familiarity with who the players in your community are, so that you can be around those tables and feel like you're not just drinking from the fire hose as the disaster is unfolding, but you already have some sense of what you might expect and how your church congregation or other ministries might be engaged.
The goal in any assessment phase is to move through it as quickly as possible so that we can move with the community into long-term recovery. So long-term recovery is sometimes mislabeled by media who are eagerly and appropriately pick up the story, say, for the first family to get their building permit to begin to build back new or make significant repairs on their home. But oftentimes there are always folks who are further ahead in that recovery process than others. And we look toward long-term recovery as beginning when it happens in a sustainable way with a cooperative effort for folks who would otherwise struggle to make recovery on their own. So once it's possible to have a sustained rebuilding presence with volunteer groups from within the community and from outside the community, for example, who are able to do the work with those who were affected by the disaster, to go from the temporary or transitional situations then into a permanent setting. So the blue tarps start to come off of the roofs as roof repairs are made. The interior of homes begins to be rebuilt from a flood, for example, or new construction begins to take place as well. The long-term recovery where the relief phase can be days or weeks or even months, and assessment is often many months. The long-term recovery, once it begins from a major event, can last for a couple of years and longer. But the important thing is that all of the work has been done ahead of time to make it a sustainable and continuous process as help is channeled to the folks who need it most.
Disciples volunteering is a main way that disciples engage through long-term recovery, and Week of Compassion provides some more back-end support during this time, helping to make connections and referrals and provide some funding as disciples are connecting with local communities and local communities are moving forward in this process of recovery. This picture comes from our project still ongoing, although in an altered fashion now that we're in a COVID world, in Puerto Rico, where our siblings at the Iglesia Cristiana Discípulos de Cristo have been operating the Programa Edifiquemos to rebuild homes that were damaged mostly from Hurricane Maria in 2017. And this is one of our congregations from Texas that went down and was engaged in that recovery. But that work is still ongoing, and we foresee at least another year or two of engagement there, which gives you a sense of just that scope and timeline for long-term recovery. The goal, hopefully, is for communities to reach what we call a new normal. You'll sometimes hear, especially in media, talking about getting back to normal. But one thing we know from disasters or any kind of community crisis or even this pandemic is there's no going back. No community will be the way it was before, because it will be altered forever. In some good ways, there will be new relationships and maybe new collaborations and new possibilities within communities, and there will be losses and grief that will carry forward as well. But there comes a time when there's new wisdom and a new sense of normalcy. This is when hopefully there are continued conversations about preparing for the next event, and mitigating for whatever comes in the future, so that we can learn from the event that has happened and be better prepared as a community, and that we can share the lessons learned with other communities, so that our neighbors and siblings and friends can be prepared and can take the wisdom that we have gained from our own experiences and take it into their communities as well. When we're thinking about preparedness, disaster preparedness specifically, it can be helpful to think in three sort of categories that get progressively broader. To start by preparing individuals and families. If families have a plan, if they are able to take care of their own immediate needs, if they have done some mitigation to make their home more secure, they have their things in order so they can deal with the effects of the disaster in their own home, they'll be more prepared to help their neighbors and their wider community. In the same way, the next step is thinking about how is our congregation prepared? Have we thought through the needs at our building? Can our property be hardened in any way or prepared for the most likely disasters? And can the functions of our church be sustainable in a disaster environment or post-disaster environment? So do we have plans in place if the power is out for a long time, or how we can adjust ministry operations if our world is suddenly turned upside down? All of that, hopefully, in addition to just good care for one another, is to position our churches to respond in the wider community. So that third level is preparing to be engaged in those full phases of disaster. Go ahead, Josh.
We commend to you a few tools that have been developed, including this risk assessment, which is a part of a congregational guide for preparedness that has been prepared.
Part of that risk assessment is thinking about the context of your community and what is most likely in your state, in your county, in your particular neighborhood, at your specific address. And what are the risks of your community? Do you have lots of folks with limited mobility because you're maybe an older congregation? Do you have folks with limited English proficiency or who communicate more comfortably in another language? Do you have other particularities in your community that could make a disaster situation, a crisis event, more difficult or more complicated? What are the unique needs that you will have to face and might be able to help respond to?
One of our goals for this tool is to help you focus, because we know that disaster preparedness itself is not necessarily the most fun activity to engage in, and it can seem really daunting. And so, to state the obvious, but also a hope for this tool is that It can help folks sort of collectively, if you work through this, say, as a small group in a congregation, really identify what are the actual risks that we are more likely to face in our particular community. And let's focus on preparedness for those specific kind of instances and not worry about events that may be more likely in a different part of the country.
We hosted one of these preparedness trainings at First Christian Church in Portland, Oregon. And there were churches from all over the region, and we had some folks who were really rural, and so they were talking about, flooding in the foothills of the mountains and how folks would get cut off from one another. And the folks who were there from First Portland said, we're in a major downtown area. We actually need to be considering some of the civil unrest potential dangers. And they've been really glad that they considered that in the training, because over the past few months, they have seen civil unrest in downtown Portland, just a few blocks from where they are. And they've had to implement some of their plans to be able to continue ministry in this moment in time. So the needs for the different congregations in the room have been wildly different as we've done these trainings, and really just highlights the specificity that goes into your own disaster plan. Some other good resources that we want to lift up to you as you're thinking about your individual and family preparedness, your congregational preparedness, and your preparations to respond in your communities. You can see the links here. We will also put these in the chat feed during the live presentation of this. But the Red Cross has a number of great resources for families. They have some really age-specific events. And this particular map, you can see what some of your most likely events are, and then you can sort your preparedness tools by those events. You might also want to cross-reference that against this great preparedness page on the Kentucky Emergency Management website. You can see they've listed there a few of the most likely events in the state of Kentucky. Obviously, those will be different from region to region within the state, but you can see what some of the resources are and specific guidance that has been compiled by your state emergency management are for those various events. The resource on the bottom left is called Flood Factor. It takes research from a bunch of different sources, lots of different data, and flood maps and weather patterns and all kinds of things to look at your risk of flooding down to a specific address. And so you can type in your congregational address or your home address, and it'll show you likelihood. And as trends continue, as we are seeing weather patterns and climate change, they're taking some of those things into account as they predict out your likelihood of flooding moving forward. So you can do some of that longer range planning as well. And there are mitigation steps that they recommend, from things as simple and cheap as clean out your gutters to major mitigation like elevate your house 8 feet, and everything in between. And so you can kind of gauge, what do we have the capacity and energy and resources to do now, but actually take some concrete steps.
Two other resources that I would lift up as well. Ready.gov is a site hosted by FEMA. September is National Preparedness Month, and so the resources you can find on ready.gov have just been updated for this recent preparedness push. And then also, when you're in process with your congregation, contact your congregation's insurance company as well and see what resources they have available, because you can bet that the preparedness and mitigation are important to them as well.
When the clouds form, the rain pours, and water is all around, you'll ask yourself, how prepared or unprepared are you? Did you raise your utilities, appliances and such? Install a sump pump, clean the drains, just in case it decides to rain. Do you know your risks? Have you checked the local plans? You should cover your property with a flood insurance policy. Is your emergency supply kit packed? Is your family prepared? Do they know what to do, where to go, and how to stay safe? Because when the water starts to rise, you must act quickly and be wise. Turn on your radio, listen for updates, and if authorities tell you to go, hurry up and do so. Get to safe ground, go as high as you can, do what you need to do, but don't put yourself in harm's way. Just inches of water can sweep you away. Once the water is gone, move carefully. Be on the lookout for dangers you can't see, animals, debris, and electricity. Do not go home until you hear the all clear. Now when you get home, be aware. Not everything is as safe as it may appear. So before the clouds form, the rain pours, and water is all around, get prepared, make a plan, and keep yourself dry. Get started today. Go to ready.gov/prepare.
Once you've assessed your risk, it's good to assess your resources. And we think of this in terms of physical resources, but also, maybe more importantly, relational resources. So in the Congregational Preparedness Guide that Josh mentioned, we have several tools at the back, including an equipment inventory, a partner and external resources inventory, and a facilities inventory. So you can think about where are the strengths and what assets do you have within your own congregation and community. You can start, expanding this out based on the connections in your community and in your congregation. If you have local government officials or school board or principals or nurses and doctors and folks with medical training, all of those kinds of resources are great to be aware of and to think through how you could draw on the expertise of those folks, those relationships, and how you can use your buildings, your ministries, your property as an asset in your preparedness plan and your possibilities for recovery. It's also a great time to identify, oh, yeah, we really probably should clean out those gutters or put some gutters or some drainage on this part of the property, and assessing some of the ways that you can enhance the resources or mitigate the risks at your own congregations. First Christian Church in Corvallis, Oregon has long been engaged with the unhoused population in Corvallis. They have had feeding programs and have cooling shelter and all kinds of different engagement with that portion of the community. They also have developed some good relationships with city and county officials. And so Matt Gordon, who's the pastor there, was talking to me a couple of weeks ago as the fires were raging in Oregon and smoke was so bad across the state. And they had just been approved to be an emergency shelter for folks who are unhoused and didn't have a way to get out of this extremely dangerous and unhealthy smoke. The air quality was so bad. And so I asked how this came about, and he said, well, I know a guy. And it was a guy at the county that they had had previous relationship with through their other ministries, who called them up and said, hey, I know y'all are engaged in this way, you care about the community, and you have this space. Would you be willing to be on our list as an emergency overflow shelter? There's a great way that those connections opened a door for First Christian in Corvallis to serve their community.
So there's another list of resources beyond our own websites. I would highlight the second one down, Kentucky VOAD. If VOAD is new for you, it's Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. Part of preparedness and resource assessment is knowing not only what resources we ourselves have, but what resources our partners have, and building those partner relationships ahead of time. So VOED is an important network, really a network of organizations that we participate with on a denominational level, on a national level. But there are state VOED organizations, and in many communities there are county-wide VOED or COADs, community organizations active in disaster, where the relationship building happens and is sustained in normal times and throughout a disaster response, throughout the cycle, really. So we encourage folks very strongly to identify and plug into the VOED network where you are, if possible, to build those relationships. And also, more traditional locations like your ministerial alliances and other pre-existing relationships that you have, even the kind of informal, as Caroline described. All of those networks and relationships become important resources as well as we're both preparing for and responding to disaster.
We also have on here the Green Chalice website, a good Kentucky-born disciple organization and ministry, because we are recognizing the ways that a changing climate is making disaster frequency and severity increase. So it is hand in hand to address the climate crisis and to be more disaster prepared. We've also had some great conversation about how becoming a more green congregation and becoming a more carbon neutral congregation can coincide with your preparation, especially as you think about preparing your building. So things that make your building more carbon neutral, better sealed windows and better insulation, and addressing some of the other structural issues at your congregation can also make your building more resilient for disasters, and can also help build some of those partnerships in the community, those key relationships. Also want to just highlight again that there are preparedness resources that are disciple specific. There's a congregational preparedness guide, and as Josh said, this can be a daunting task. And if you just need to start building some energy, feel like you're checking some things off the to-do list, you can start with a 10 easy steps to become more prepared checklist, I guess, that is also available at the Week of Compassion website. You can find both of those resources as well as links to other resources at weekofcompassion.org/prepare. You'll also see in that guide a much more elaborate description of the phases of disaster that will help you understand what might unfold in your community and help you think through where to engage. And we are happy to do a more specific and more in-depth conversation with your congregation as you work through that guide. If you're interested, reach out to either one of us. Here's our contact information. What last thoughts do you have, Josh, before we turn to a time of questions?
Well, it has been a pleasure sharing in this presentation, and I look forward to any questions that folks may have.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining the Zoom and being here for a live Q&A. We have found in our past disaster trainings that the conversation and questions can be some of the most fruitful time. And so trying to do that over YouTube comments did not sound productive. So thanks for adapting to this format. And we'll open the floor. I don't think we got any questions on the full chat. Chris, did we get any directly to you as the host?
I did not.
Okay.
But I have just allowed everybody, if they have a question, should be able to unmute themselves. If not, you can raise your hand and I'll make sure you can.
Okay. Rachel asks, can we speak a bit about tornado and ice storm preparation? Yeah, those are probably among your most likely events there in Kentucky, or at least in parts of Kentucky. Both of those events are likely to have power outages associated with them, and are likely to have things like roof damage, trees falling. So some of your basic ways to prepare for those would be make sure people have generators, or if you're talking about your congregation, that maybe you have a couple of generators that could be used at the church, and that people know how to properly use them. One of the great tips after disasters, and often where some of the highest casualty numbers come are from people misusing generators or using them inside, and so you have carbon monoxide poisoning issues. So it's that, it's preparation for power outages, doing some assessment of, are your trees trimmed in ways that are good, where you're going to reduce damage to structures if you have limbs falling, making sure your roof and gutters and flashing and all those things stay well maintained, and that doors and windows and other entry points to your building stay well maintained and sealed. Josh, any other thoughts about kind of physical preparation?
No, I was just thinking from more of a community standpoint, then it's important to have some awareness for where temporary shelters might be available, and whether potentially that might be something that your congregation could get involved in. The Red Cross is a great resource for those conversations, but having an alternative, hopefully temporary housing identified for folks, especially with the likelihood of the power outage, extensive power outages in the winter or whenever a tornado may strike.
I'll also say that the Insurance Board of the United Church of Christ, and I would imagine many other insurance companies, as well as ready.gov, have disaster specific kind of checklists. So you can pull up the tornado checklist and it'll have some good preparatory steps. In terms of thinking about response, debris cleanup is going to be a big issue after tornadoes, and just helping neighbors kind of sift through and sort debris and tarp roofs. So if you have folks who are interested in that kind of work, doing some advanced training to know how to safely clear off debris and how to safely and effectively tarp a roof can be some ways that you can be prepared to help your neighbors in your community afterwards. Yes, and Mary Thomas says to know the timelines for safety with food, with power outages for refrigerated foods. I think that's 4 hours for refrigerated foods, and I don't remember for frozen, but usually the news is pushing that message out pretty regularly. Rachel, did we answer your question? Okay, great. Other questions, comments, things we spoke too quickly in the recorded video and that you need us to repeat? I would be curious to hear from some of you, your reactions to the questions that we posed through the video. And I know they kind of went fast. I'm sorry. I should have given you more thinking time with those interludes. It felt very long when I was editing the video, and then very short just now. But what phases you recall hearing about the most when we think about that full cycle of the phases of disaster? What do you hear about? in the news when disasters happen? And what phases do you picture your congregations most likely to plug into? Or where have you in the past plugged in? First Christian Madisonville had a shelter area with contracts for generators. But that's excellent. What, that was after ice storm, tornado, ice storm? Excellent. And that's where those connections with local emergency management or like the local ministerial alliance can be really helpful, so that people know that you're available as a shelter and that you never know what kinds of resources might be available that could help you as you do that kind of work.
I think that the information that you've shared is very valuable. It's important, I think, that a church have a system of communicating with all members to let the membership know what's going on. We're a part of an older congregation in Northern Kentucky, and when something happens, we need to have a way to communicate with our members. So that would be very important. We've had some local disasters, power outages and things like that, and you find out how prepared you are or not prepared. And what you said about knowing where important documents are, especially insurance policies for your church, that's so critical because you're going to need them. And you need someone in charge.
Yeah, a church I served, which will remain unnamed, was very proactive and saved all of their important documents on a flash drive so that they would have hard copy and digital copies. And then they stored the flash drive on top of the file cabinet where the hard copies were. So we realized, oh, if this building floods or there's a fire in the office, we're going to lose both copies. And so we moved that flash drive. I think the board chair ended up taking it to her home. But thinking about, can you access those documents from multiple locations? If your building is completely inaccessible, will you still be able to get to your important documents? And will you be able to get to your contact list for your people? Talking to a pastor in advance of Hurricane Harvey, I asked if she had grabbed the directory, and she realized she had not, and ran back up to the church, grabbed the hard copy directory so that she could be sure that she could contact all of her people if she was stuck at home, which she was for several days, could not get out of her neighborhood, but was able to be in touch with all of her congregants because she had that list. What many of our congregations don't include in the typical church directory is who your point of contact would be in an emergency. So if somebody is unreachable after a disaster, who do we contact to see if anybody's heard from them, to know if they're okay? Do we know where they might evacuate? We've seen this with a few different hurricanes when folks were under either voluntary or mandatory evacuation, and our pastors had no idea where their folks had gone. And with as many people having cell phones now, that's less of an issue, but especially with some of our older congregants who may or may not have those cell phone access, knowing where they might go and how to get a hold of them in a disaster is something to consider in advance.
Right. And another thing related to that, you mentioned cell phones. If the power is out and your cell phone runs out of power, what to do next? And I can see that being a real question. We think, oh, we're going to be able to plug into the wall, but if the wall is powerless, then pretty soon we're going to be powerless too. So what to do next?
Yeah, we talked to a lot of pastors who said, okay, this is my 10 minutes to go run the car. We talked to a lot of folks in Puerto Rico when they were out of power for so long, that they rationed their vehicle time so that they could charge their phones and stay in touch with people. But yeah, thinking about, do we have access to emergency power for those communication pieces as well?
And just a question, is our church on the move as far as being of help to the disaster in the West with the fires? I mean, I watch on television and I think, oh my goodness, those poor folks. But do we have a plan? Are we responding to that area of the country?
Yeah, absolutely. Both in California and in Oregon, we have congregations affected by a number of the fires, either with folks who had to evacuate for prolonged periods, and then folks who actually did have damage to their homes. I think all of our church buildings were okay. A couple were close to fires, but I don't think any actually had damage at church buildings. But several of those congregations, especially in the Oregon region, have been incredibly active in helping their neighbors. I had lifted up Corvallis, and then there have been multiple coordinated responses across the region. And now we're entering that phase that Josh had talked about a bit, which is that assessment phase. And the next few months are going to be a slog as we look at how we plan for recovery. But because we have churches in close proximity to some of the worst fires, we are quite confident that disciples will remain involved, and we're thinking about the best partnerships to make that effective, and connecting them with local long-term recovery groups and community organizations, so that we can be collaborative in our responses as well.
Hey, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're sort of in that phase in a number of places. We're in that same phase in Iowa from the August severe windstorm. In Louisiana, we're still kind of in relief, especially as Hurricane Delta hit the same areas that Hurricane Laura hit. So we kind of got moved back in those phases, but sort of in relief and on the edge of that assessment phase in Florida, as well as in Alabama. Not Florida, Louisiana, and then Alabama and Northwest Florida from Hurricane Sally. And then we're in recovery phase in a bunch of places across the country. Josh and I were just going over our sticky note list yesterday, and it's really, it gives me great pride in the disciples for the ways that we're able to walk with communities all across the country.
Caroline, could you talk a little bit about maybe what kind of preparedness we need to do now that we're in the age of COVID-19? I mean, that event is nothing that's, immediately impactful, but it seems like from this point on, there could be a lot of things, that could impact the community, especially like with food and shelter and homelessness and unemployment. What kind of things can we do to, prepare ourselves more for a long-term disaster like that could even go into, we're talking into next year sometime.
Yeah, well, I think the wisdom around this virtual room is probably as valuable, more valuable than what I can contribute here. So I hope you're talking to one another as you're thinking about those things. Fundamentally, it's the same way that we prepare for anything, and that's connect with as many partners around as you can, and know who's doing what in your community and where there might be gaps. So paying attention across your community, where are the needs that aren't getting filled, and who might we be able to partner with to fill those needs. And then also that same kind of assessment piece of what ministries do we already have in our congregation. If you're already doing feeding ministry, lean into what you do and what you're passionate about and good about and good at doing. That said, there are some needs that are really coming to light because of this pandemic. Emotional and psychological needs, rent. I was just looking at some statistics across Texas, which is where I live, around what's going to happen come January 1 when our moratorium on evictions ends. So churches around here thinking about how can we provide some emergency rent support, or accompany folks through the eviction court process. Sort of those emergency assistance programs as well. Josh, do you have thoughts?
I mean, you said the key thing I was going to say, which is it's really a time to lean into existing networks and relationships with other faith communities or whatever networks exist that your congregations are a part of. And it also creates an opportunity for expanding those conversations as well. And I think the other thing I was going to say that Caroline also said is really identify the sort of the gifts, resources, the assets, and that are already available, and that will highlight the gaps that either your congregation might be able to help meet, or that might make it easier to identify other places in the community where those resources exist that aren't a part of the conversation, and bring those folks to the table as well. It's been interesting. A lot of in communities where there are, we mentioned in the presentation about VOAD, voluntary organizations active in disaster. Many communities, especially if they've been through a couple disasters or more, have standing what they'll call COADs, community organizations active in disaster. And some of those pre-existing COADs have been finding a different kind of life as they've shifted. Even COADs that have existed for 20 years and have responded to 4 or 5 natural disasters have been challenged by the coronavirus, but also have it has brought new energy into those groups and new partnerships as they've just meet virtually even, and discuss the needs and brainstorm ways to collectively solve those challenges.
The other piece that I would say here is that the coronavirus itself creates some different challenges for responding. So the ways that we would normally collaborate with folks would be to get everybody around a table and talk. We can't do that as easily now. So still finding ways to make those connections, and in all things, making sure we're thinking through how we protect our volunteers and protect folks who we're trying to serve. That we have a duty to do no harm, first of all. And so if our helping ends up hurting people, that's a problem. So thinking about good protocols for PPE and distancing, and how we can provide assistance to folks and accompany folks through this ongoing disaster without undue risk for ourselves, our volunteers, or our communities. The other piece that I would lift up here in that congregational guide is another visual that goes through those phases of disaster, but it does a little like roller coaster image. And it came out of work about emotional and psychological community responses to crisis events and trauma events. And we've seen it play out collectively and individually, with this high as the community comes together right after an event, and we're going to get through this, and Boston strong. And then there's a crash as just that kind of emotional fatigue wears in, sets in and wears on us. And so that's one of the places the church can step in disaster response. And through this COVID ongoing crisis that we're living through, is in that valley as people are falling into despair and disillusionment, before we start making that turn up to new hope and new wisdom and a new normal through recovery, that we can walk with people through the lowest lows, both with emotional and spiritual support and trying to meet some of their immediate needs. I am mindful that there is another workshop at 7 p.m. and we don't want to prevent anybody from getting to that who needs to have a bio break before you have your other workshop. So if you need to drop off, feel free to do so. And we'll do a couple more minutes of questions. I also have a 7 o'clock meeting, so I will also be dropping off in about 3 minutes. Any final thoughts, questions? Chris, will you capture the chat and share that with everybody?
Yeah, so we'll actually have an entire recording of the entire presentation and Q&A on YouTube by tomorrow morning, and then I'll have the chat on there as well. Awesome. And those who are registered for the assembly will get that emailed tomorrow late afternoon from Terry Royster, as they should have been every day this week. Thank you so much, Caroline and Josh.
Thank you all for your time this evening. I know that through this pandemic, we're all living through crisis, so thinking about disaster preparedness might feel a little overwhelming, but it's also a really good time to be thinking about it, because if you take a minute, I think you'll identify some things that you've learned during this pandemic that will serve you well as you think about preparing for future disasters. You've probably already taken some steps to be more prepared that you didn't even realize were preparedness steps. They were just you trying to adapt to this moment. So thanks for starting this work or continuing this work and joining us this evening.
Thanks to our leaders for your time and presentations.
Any last thoughts, Josh?
Yep. Thanks, everyone.